Chapter 18. The Mission is in the Name. Black people from the South were headed to Chicago, to Detroit, to New York. Some even came from the Caribbean to escape colonialism. A Jamaican man, Marcus Garvey, was one of them. He'd come to America to raise money for a school in Jamaica, and the first thing he did once he arrived in New York in 1916 was to visit the NAACP office. The NAACP was started by two men who had written books about the anti-slavery activist John Brown. In 1859, Brown, a white man, raided the United States Armory in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, with the intention of arming slaves and starting a revolution. He was caught and, of course, executed. Du Bois wrote Brown's biography, and the year it was published, 1909, was also the year a man named Oswald Garrison Villard published his biography of John Brown. Villard was white and happened to be William Lloyd Garrison's grandson. Who do you think sold more books? But instead of Du Bois cutting Villard down like he did Booker T. Washington, he decided to work with Villard to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. Their mission was in the name. And when Marcus Garvey showed up, he was expecting that mission to be shown in the actual people working for the organization. See, Garvey was looking for Du Bois, but when he got to the office, he was confused about whether the NAACP was a black organization or a white one. And that was simply because no one dark-skinned worked there. It was as if the only black people who could succeed in America were biracial or lighter-skinned. As if the talented 10th were the only black people of value. Such an assimilationist way of thinking. An anti-racist like Garvey saw all black people as valuable, saw blackness as valuable in culture and in color. So Garvey decided to set up shop in Harlem and start his own organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Its purpose was to focus on African solidarity, the beauty of dark skin and African American culture and global African self-determination. He basically created the exact opposite of the talented 10th. Garvey wasn't the only one who noticed the growing power of biracial Americans. Scholars were paying attention. Eugenicists, people who believed you could control the quality of a human being by keeping undesirable genetics out, meaning the genetics of black people, were criticizing and berating the mixing of races because whiteness was seen as pure. There were new versions of the racial hierarchy, which weren't that new because black people still existed at the bottom. But the argument was that the more white, Nordic blood people had, the better they would be intellectually. Listen, I could give you more of their lines, but I've said this a million times by now. They were arguing what they'd been arguing, that black people were born to be less than, and that mixing with whites gave them a leg up because then they weren't all the way black. This would tie in with the creation of IQ tests and standardized tests, all skewed to justify the dumb black, and the ones that did well must have had some white in them, yada, yada, yada. Yet in the midst of the Great War, black men were good enough to fight, smart enough to be tactical, motivated enough to run, roll, shoot, and save, of course. Du Bois went over to Paris after the war ended to document the stories of black soldiers for The Crisis, the newspaper he'd started. The stories he was told and that he documented were ones of black heroes. But when the white officers came back to the States to tell their versions of the stories, the black heroes had become black nothings. More important, black soldiers had been treated relatively well in France. And the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, feared that being treated decently overseas would embolden black soldiers, make them too big for their britches, make them expect fair treatment at home, the home for which they just risked their lives. Let that sink in. The home for which they bled for, killed for. This was the final gust of wind. Not really the final, but he was getting there. On Du Bois's tiptoe tightrope walk of racism. His past critiques of anti-racists, spinning them into imaginary hate mongers, had finally come back to bite him. He'd spent so many years trying to convince black people to mold themselves into a version of white people. He'd spent so much time trying to learn, speak, dress, and impress racism away. He tried to provide white Americans with the scientific facts of racial disparities, believing reason could kill racism, as if reason had birthed it. He had even spent energy ridiculing leaders like Ida B. Wells Barnett for passionately calling on black people to fight. But every year, as the failures for freedom piled up, Du Bois's urgings for black people to protest and fight became stronger. Du Bois, the king of assimilation, began calling out white men's twisting of words. It was time for a new Negro, he preached, one that would no longer sit quietly, waiting to assimilate. And in 1919, when many of those soldiers came home from war, they came home as new Negroes. Unfortunately, new Negroes were met by old whites, violence. The normal racist ideas weren't working on black people, so racists had to go above and beyond. The summer of 1919 was the bloodiest summer since Reconstruction. So much so, it was named Red Summer. Du Bois responded to Red Summer with a collection of essays arguing many things about black people being people. But one of the most revolutionary things he did in the collection was honor black women. This was a huge deal because black women had either been completely left out of the race conversation or turned into objects to look at and take advantage of. Even though Du Bois had done this, Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican who had taken issue with the NAACP, still despised him. Like I said, Garvey was a staunch anti-racist. Though Du Bois was making anti-racist strides, he was still straddling the assimilation line, and Garvey thought he was condescending to his own race, that he moved and acted like he was a better black person, a special black person, an exception. And of course, there was the biggest beef of all, the conflict around the premise that lighter-skinned people were being given advantages and treated better, colorism. Garvey wasn't completely wrong. Though Du Bois wanted black people to be a people with the freedom to be different when it came to art and music and spirituality, he definitely looked at himself as the standard. So if you weren't him, light-skinned, hyper-educated, you weren't quite good enough. He also reinforced Harriet Beecher Stowe's idea that black people had more soul than whites, which meant they had less mind, and therefore were better at creative things. Garvey would have argued against that, but he didn't get the chance to because the U.S. government charged him with mail fraud, and he was deported 3 years later. With no one there to challenge him, Du Bois's old crutch that he just couldn't seem to divorce himself from, uplift suasion, was about to transform into a different kind of be my friend bait. Chapter 19. Can't sing and dance and write it away. Du Bois had now become the older guy hanging around all the young artists up in Harlem. On March 21st, 1924, he'd gone to a club to see a bunch of young poets and novelists who were supporters of his. This event is where he'd meet many of the young black artists who would form what's now known as the Harlem Renaissance. And Du Bois wanted to make sure they used their art to advance black people by getting white people to respect them. It was a new form of uplift suasion, media suasion, which basically just means using media, in this case art, to woo whites. But not everyone was kissing Du Bois's assimilationist feet. There was a resistant group of artists that emerged in 1926 who called themselves the Niggerati. They believed they should be able to make whatever they wanted to express themselves as a whole group without worrying about white acceptance. One of this group's most prominent poets was Langston Hughes, who declared that if a black race artist leaned toward whiteness, his art wouldn't truly be his own, that it was okay to be a black artist without having to feel insecurity or shame. They wanted to function the same way as the blues women like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, who sang about pain and sex and whatever else they wanted to, even if the images of blackness weren't always positive. W.E.B. Du Bois and his supporters of uplift suasion and media suasion had a hard time accepting any narrative of Black people being less than perfect, less than dignified. But this group, they were arguing that if Black people couldn't be shown as imperfect, they couldn't be shown as human, and that was racist. It would be up to Black artists to show themselves, to write and paint and dance and sculpt their humanity, whether white people liked it or not, whether white people saw them as human or not. And they didn't see them as human. Instead, Black people were symbols, animals, and ideas to be feared. As a matter of fact, in 1929, 3 years after the formation of this group, Claude G. Bowers, an editor for the New York Post, confirmed this in a book he wrote called The Tragic Era, The Revolution After Lincoln. Lincoln? Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln had been dead for more than 60 years, but Reconstruction, if spun correctly, could be used as a way to play upon the hatred of racist white people. This was a way Bowers could tap back into the old days, drum up that old hateful feeling, rev the engine of racism, which, by the way, was still just as alive and consistent, which is why anti-racist artists, like the group we were talking about, found it silly to play into white comfort. Bowers was angry about the fact that Herbert Hoover, a Republican, swept the election in 1928. Remember the switcheroo? Snatching several southern states. The tragic era was meant to remind Democrats, Southerners, and racists that innocent white people were tortured by Black Republicans during Reconstruction. It's almost laughable. Almost. But it charged up racists and even sparked a re-release of the racist classic, Birth of a Nation. The argument of the savage, inferior Black person rides again. It's getting exhausting, right? And this time, Du Bois, who'd been slowly inching toward anti-racism, decided to respond to the Bowers book. Du Bois wrote and published what he thought was his best work, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880. In it, he debunked all of Bowers's arguments and described how, if anything, Reconstruction was stifled by white racist elites who created more white privileges for poor white people as long as they stood shoulder to shoulder on the necks of Black people. Whiteness first, always whiteness first. It was 1933. Du Bois's life as an assimilationist had finally started to vaporize. He just wanted Black people to be self-sufficient, to be Black, and for that to be enough. Here he argued that the American educational system was failing the country because it wouldn't tell the truth about race in America, because it was too concerned with protecting and defending the white race. Ultimately, he was arguing what he'd been arguing in various different ways, and what Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Marcus Garvey, and many others before him had argued ad nauseum, that Black people were human, despite uplift suasion, despite media suasion. Despite the fact that the NAACP was under new leadership, Walter White, who had decided to lean more into uplift suasion, White wanted to transform the NAACP into an organization of refined folks like himself, whose mission was to go before courts and politicians to persuade the white judges and legislators to end racial discrimination. But in 1933, Du Bois wanted nothing to do with this method. He had finally turned away from assimilationism. He had finally turned toward anti-racism. So he took off from the NAACP, escaping the madness and bureaucracy, and headed down to Atlanta University to teach. He'd taken up a new school of thought. Inspired by Karl Marx, Du Bois broke ground on a new idea, anti-racist socialism. He used this idea to move further into anti-racism, even critiquing Black colleges for having white-centered curriculums or for having white teachers teaching Negro studies in Black schools. The reason he turned such a sharp corner was, perhaps, because the country had entered into the Great Depression. No one had money, but it's one thing to have no money. It's another thing to have no money and no freedom. So Black people were experiencing a kind of double depression. And even though the sitting president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, had developed an initiative called the New Deal, a flurry of government relief programs and job programs to keep people afloat, Black people needed their own New Deal to keep them safe from the old deal, which was the racist deal, which was no deal at all. Note, this was the start of the shift, where the Democratic and Republican parties started transforming into the ones we have today. It's not that the New Deal didn't help Black people at all. It did, just not enough, and not at the same rate as it helped white people. And while poor Black people were trying to build their own systems, and as elite Black people were uncomfortable in pushing back against Du Bois, he published an article that would rock everyone. It was 1934. The piece was called Segregation. Du Bois sided with his former rival, Marcus Garvey, stating that there is a place, maybe even an importance, to a voluntary, non-discriminatory separation. Basically, Du Bois was arguing for Black safe spaces, spaces that would resist and fight against the media storm of racist ideas that came year after year. From the stereotype that Black people were sexually immoral or hypersexual, or that Black households were absent of fathers and that this family dynamic made them inferior, or that skin tone and hair texture were connected to beauty and intelligence. Du Bois, without the consent of his partners at the NAACP, the assimilationists who were once in line with him, wanted to combat it all. Chapter 20. Home is where the hatred is. World War II. I know this isn't supposed to be a history book, but come on. After the United States entered World War II in 1942, Du Bois felt energized by Black America's Double V campaign, victory against racism at home and victory against fascism abroad. The Double V campaign kicked the civil rights movement into high gear. And as World War II neared its end in April 1945, W.E.B. Du Bois joined representatives of 50 countries at the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco. He wanted the new United Nations Charter to become a buffer against racism. Then later in the year, Du Bois attended the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. Pan-Africanism is a movement that encourages solidarity among all people of African descent. Strength in numbers, global power, that was the key. At the 5th Congress in 1945, Du Bois was fittingly introduced as the father of Pan-Africanism. In attendance were 200 men and women, including Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, young revolutionaries who would go on to lead the African decolonization movements, which were meant to remove colonial leaders. These delegates did not make the politically racist request of past Pan-African Congresses of gradual decolonization, as if Africans were not ready to rule Africans. And what I mean when I mention Africans ruling Africans is Africans governing themselves. Imagine that. It must have felt like a bomb dropped on the heads of racist Europeans. Those weren't the only bombs dropping. The United States emerged from World War II, looked over at the ravaged European and East Asian worlds, and flexed its unmatched capital, industrial force, and military arms as the new global leader. The only problem was America, the land of the free, home of the brave, still had a race problem. And that race problem was starting to affect its relationships around the world. American freedom wasn't free. Heck, it wasn't even real. But no matter what compromises, President Harry Truman, who took over after Roosevelt died in 1945, tried to make, the South always fought back. I almost don't want to tell you what happened because I've told you what happened a lot already. But if you were to guess that white people started to perpetuate lies about Black people being inferior to keep the world of racism spinning, you'd be right. On February 2nd, 1948, Truman urged Congress to implement a Civil Rights Act despite the lack of support among white Americans. You can imagine the outrage. Many left the Democratic Party. Others stayed and formed what they called the Dixiecrats, who, in order to fight back against Truman's push for civil rights, ran a man named Strom Thurmond for president. It was a grossly segregationist platform. Fortunately, it didn't work. Black voters made sure Truman won, and once he did, his administration brought forth a new game-changing civil rights case. Actually, a few game-changing civil rights cases. One, Shelley versus Kramer, 1948. The case was decided with the Supreme Court determining that the courts could not enforce whites-only real estate contracts in northern cities to keep out migrants and stop housing desegregation. This brought on the open housing movement, which basically exposed white people stopping black people from living where they wanted to live. The fear was the same old fear that black people would make the neighborhoods dangerous, that their white daughters would be in danger, that the property value would go down. Some black people wanted to live in white neighborhoods for validation. Some black people were just looking for better housing options. Some white people were so afraid they literally packed up and left their homes. White flight. 2, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. I'm sure you've heard of this one. If you live in the South and go to a diverse school, this is why. This was the case that said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The results? The schools began to mix. What's really interesting about this case, though, something rarely discussed, is that it's actually a pretty racist idea. I mean, what it basically suggests is that black kids need a fair shot, and a fair shot is in white schools. I mean, why weren't there any white kids integrating into black schools? The assumption was that black kids weren't as intelligent because they weren't around white kids, as if the mere presence of white kids would make black kids better. Not true. A good school is a good school, whether there are white people there or not. Oh, and of course, people were pissed about this. People were pissed about them both, and pissed people do pissed things. A year later, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi for supposedly hissing at a white woman. They beat Till so ruthlessly that his face was unrecognizable during his open casket funeral in his native Chicago. The gruesome pictures were shown around the enraged black world at the request of his mother. And those supremacists in power continued to blame Brown versus Board of Education for the problems. Young Emmett's death lit a fire under the civil rights movement, led by a young, charismatic preacher from Atlanta who idolized W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr. There was a youthful energy to the movement, a new way of doing things, and Du Bois loved watching it grow more and more powerful. He was now 90 years old and hopeful. He'd never stopped struggling, and Dr. King was cut from similar cloth. He and Du Bois had not let up, and neither had college students. 4 black freshmen at North Carolina A&T entered a Woolworth's in Greensboro on February 1st, 1960. They sat down at the whites-only counter, where they were denied service, and stayed there until the store closed. Within days, hundreds of students from area colleges and high schools were sitting in. News reports of these non-violent sit-ins flashed on TV screens nationally, setting off a sit-in wave to desegregate Southern businesses. By April, students were staging sit-ins in 78 Southern and border communities, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had been established. These college kids were like new Negroes. They weren't waiting for white saviors, not in politicians like John F. Kennedy, who was running for office, or writers like Harper Lee, whose novel To Kill a Mockingbird was basically the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the civil rights movement. Don't mind if I don't. Nope, no white saviors for them, but they also weren't interested in being black saviors. They weren't necessarily saving themselves, they were just being themselves. But the thing about being black is that just being can bring bloodshed. And that's what Dr. King and the SNCC and the civil rights movement as a whole were banking on. The vicious violence in response to the nonviolent civil rights movement was embarrassing the country all around the non-white world. On April 3, 1963, King helped kick off a series of demonstrations in Birmingham, bringing on the wrath of the city's ruggedly segregationist police chief, Bull Connor. 9 days later, on Good Friday, 8 white anti-segregationist Alabama clergymen signed a public statement requesting that these unwise and untimely street demonstrations end. Martin Luther King Jr., jailed that same day, read the statement from his cell. Angry, he started doing something he rarely did. He responded to the critics in his Letter from Birmingham Jail, published that summer. No one knows whether the sickly W.E.B. Du Bois read King's jailhouse letter, but just as Du Bois had done in 1903 and later regretted, in his letter, King erroneously conflated two opposing groups, the anti-racists who hated racial discrimination and the black separationists who hated white people, in groups like the Nation of Islam. King later distanced himself from both, speaking to a growing split within the civil rights movement. More and more battle-worn young activists were becoming frustrated with King's nonviolence and were more often listening to Malcolm X's sermons. Malcolm X was a minister in the Nation of Islam, a religious organization focused on the liberation of Black people through discipline, self-defense, community organizing, and a fortified understanding of who Black people were regardless of white people's opinions. He preached that Blacks were the original people of the world, which pushed back against the Bible and the early theories of white Egypt. He also preached Black self-sufficiency, that Black people would care for themselves, could care for themselves, their families, and their communities all by themselves. Sure, he was a polarizing force, but he was also an anti-racist, persuading away assimilationist ideas. On May 3rd, 1963, the young folks that followed leaders like Malcolm watched on television as Bull Connor's vicious bloodhounds ripped to pieces the children and teenagers of Black Birmingham who had been following Dr. King, as Connor's fire hoses broke limbs, blew clothes off, and slammed bodies into storefronts, and as his officers clubbed marchers with nightsticks. The world watched, too. On June 11th, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, or the world rather, and summoned Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Today, we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and to protect the rights of all who wish to be free, Kennedy said. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. With the eyes of the globe on him, Kennedy, who really didn't have much of a choice, introduced civil rights legislation. But it didn't stop the momentum of the long-awaited March on Washington for jobs and freedom. Though it had been organized by civil rights groups, the Kennedy administration controlled the event, ruling out civil disobedience. Kennedy aides approved the speakers and speeches. No Black women, no James Baldwin, an openly gay Black novelist who'd become a bold and brilliant political voice through his writings, and no Malcolm X. On August 28th, approximately 250,000 activists and reporters from around the world marched to the area between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. And King closed the day with what's probably the most iconic speech of all time. I have a dream. But there was bad news. W.E.B. Du Bois had died in his sleep the previous day. Indeed, a younger Du Bois had called for such a gathering, hoping it would persuade millions of white people to love the lowly souls of Black folk. And yes, the older Du Bois had chosen another path, the anti-racist path less traveled, toward forcing millions to accept the equal souls of Black folk. It was the path of civil disobedience that the young marchers in the SNCC and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, also responsible for much of the nonviolence training for the movement, had desired for the March on Washington, a path a young woman from Birmingham's Dynamite Hill was already traveling and would never leave. But Roy Wilkins, one of Dr. King's right-hand men and the bearer of the bad news, did not dwell on the different paths. Looking out at the lively March on Washington, he just asked for a moment of silence to honor the 95-year-old movement of a man.